Hello and welcome to Japan Expert Insights and our discussion series on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Every second Monday, Dr. Stephen Nagy, Senior Associate Professor at the Department of Politics and International Studies at the International Christian University in Tokyo, and host Maya Matsuoka, host a discussion on the latest developments, new challenges, and shifts in the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific region. In this podcast, we welcome comments, questions, and opinions, so if you haven't done so yet, join us next time. In the meantime, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the Japan's role in the Indo-Pacific region. Again, Professor Nagy, Stephen Nagy is with us. We're going to talk about some of the latest events in geopolitics and events that influence the region, the Indo-Pacific region. You're very welcome to join us, so please do not hesitate to do that. Hopefully, we can hear your voices tonight. So, without any further ado, Stephen, let's start and, proceed.
All right. Well, good evening, Maya, and good evening, everybody in the room. It's great to talk to you. I think this week what we're going to focus on is Prime Minister Kishida's visit overseas. He visited many countries overseas, including the United States, Canada, France, Italy, and I think that this, in many ways, signals a strong message of continuity in terms of Indo-Pacific policy, the focus on a rules-based order, focus on cooperation with like-minded countries in terms of dealing with the challenges that not only Japan's facing, but I think many countries are facing. We are in a period of very volatile geopolitics. So in this sense, the visit to all these capitals was important in terms of Prime Minister Kishida winning some political capital at home, but again, trying to align how Tokyo is thinking with other countries. In that sense, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about what I think he achieved on this visit, how it's related to the Indo-Pacific strategy of Japan, and what we can expect moving forward. So let's think about this visit in terms of its concrete achievements. And I think that the biggest concrete achievement probably was the visit to Washington, in which Prime Minister Kishida and President Biden, amongst other things, reiterated the importance of the alliance, which is something that always happens when every prime minister of Japan visits Washington, that this is the cornerstone of Japan's security. It only thinks about, or it depends deeply and primarily on the alliance for Japan's security within the region, and that every possible visit that Tokyo has to Washington really reaffirms that. I think that was an important aspect of the visit. Second, and I think importantly, is the recognition of Japan's significant shift in terms of foreign policy related to the national security strategy and its associated documents, with Japan agreeing to bolster spending to 2% of GDP in 5 years, to invest in many kinds of domain awareness technologies so that Japan has a much better understanding of the challenges that it's going to face within the region. That I think that this is something that was welcome in Washington, welcome in many capitals except for North Korea and in China, to see Japan actually step up to the plate and really invest in its security. And we don't call this burden sharing, we call this burden shifting, in that Japan is now taking on a bigger burden for its security within the region. And this is something I think that the United States is very happy about. It has similar views about the European Union also, and European states also taking on a bigger burden. So burden shifting, because the United States can't do everything. It needs to concentrate on its resources on, of course, defending the United States, but also concentrate its resources in a way that maximizes its comparative advantages. So I think that this is really important. In addition to the take-home about reinforcing the alliance and supporting the new national security strategy, I do think what's also really important in terms of this discussion is the enhanced cooperation in space. And this is not a Star Trek kind of cooperation where they're trekking across the galaxy. Rather, they're thinking about how they can enhance their space domain awareness so that they can deal with the security challenges that are associated with China. And what I mean by that is that there's real concern that China is getting some momentum in terms of its ability to engage in different kinds of conflict within the region without the Americans and Japanese and other countries understanding what the Japanese and the Chinese are doing. So in this sense, the enhanced cooperation in terms of space cooperation, it really sets the tone where the United States and Japan, along with other like-minded countries, are going to start to strengthen their cooperation in space so they get a comprehensive understanding of where China and North Korea are putting their resources. And the big picture here is we're thinking about what's China going to do with Taiwan, but also the broader region, including the South China Sea, East China Sea, where it's going to put its commitment to expanding its nuclear arsenal. And how can Japan, working with the United States, get a good sense of these locations so that they can build the deterrence capabilities to ensure that these new systems that China is bringing online don't threaten Japan. And this is really, really, I think, important. So space cooperation. The same holds true for North Korea. I think that the United States and Japan want to have the best understanding possible of how North Korea is placing its weapon systems, how they're moving missile systems throughout its territory, so that it can build the deterrence capabilities that will push back against, at least give Japan and the United States the potential or the opportunity to push back against and defend against these really serious tools of coercion. I think that we also look at the space-based cooperation as very forward thinking as how the United States and Japan can coordinate technological development and other forms of cooperation to really outcompete China on these core areas. Now, Prime Minister Kishida also visited Canada. There, I think that the visit fell short. And it fell short in terms of no commitment in terms of energy cooperation, which is something that I think the Japanese are very much looking to Canada to be part of. The idea is that having a stable, reliable, and like-minded country providing resources to Japan will be really, really important moving forward, especially as Russia becomes a much more provocative and unreliable partner for energy provision. But also as the deepening alignment between China and Russia continues. So I think that is an important visit. But Prime Minister Kishida also visited Europe. And I think that as Prime Minister Kishida visits Europe, here again, and this included the UK, we see Japan signing what's called a reciprocal access agreement with the UK, so a similar treaty agreement with the Australians in terms of some joint training, the UK being able to visit Japan freely and vice versa, being able to put different defensive systems in each other's countries as well, I think is really, really important. So we see that Japan, to secure its interests regionally, is forming a very, very strong multi-layered bilateral and multilateral relations with like-minded countries with the mindset of trying to create enough deterrence to push back against not only China, but also North Korea. So I think these are really important take-homes. They're good for Prime Minister Kishida in terms of his reputation back home, but really importantly, I think that the visit really highlights how Japan is connecting its national interests and its domestic security to international cooperation, multilateral cooperation, and bilateral cooperation. Now, other important take-homes from this visit, again, is that Prime Minister Kishida was out there talking about his priorities for the Indo-Pacific region, but also I think his priorities for the upcoming Hiroshima summit, in which Prime Minister Kishida will host the G7 leaders in his hometown, Hiroshima. And again, this will be highlighting some of Japan's priorities, but also Prime Minister Kishida's priorities as a prime minister from Hiroshima, in particular the idea of denuclearization of not only this region, but denuclearization of the world. So I think that these are important take-homes for Prime Minister Kishida. The question is will these translate into a political capital at home that allow him to have some political sustainability or some longevity in terms of leadership. And here we don't know. I think that it's too early to tell. We did see Ishiba Shigeru hold a press conference, which wasn't very flattering to Prime Minister Kishida. And we see that Prime Minister Kishida is facing some challenges at home in terms of how he's going to fund his new committed increases in defense spending. But in terms of the broader Indo-Pacific, I think what's really important for us to be thinking about is that the national security strategy and Japan's overall Indo-Pacific engagement really continues to be supported by the international community broadly. And what I mean by the international community broadly, here I'm thinking about, of course, the United States, Canada, European countries. South Korea, surprisingly, had a speech by the South Korean President Yoon, that basically made a statement is, what do you expect of Japan when it's facing such a secure or insecure security environment with North Korea, with China, and now with Russia? And I think that is important as a take-home, is that we often hear about the fears of Japan in terms of its changing Article 9 or building up its defense posture. But whether it's Southeast Asia or South Asia or the European countries, Australia, New Zealand, or Canada, United States, we see broad support and trust in Japan's national security strategy and its defense buildup because there's a good understanding of Japan's post-World War II international reputation as being a good global citizen in the international community, but also a clear understanding that any kind of increase in spending still is going to be interpreted through Article 9 and through Japan's post-World War II non-militaristic or non-military supportive mindset. So this is interesting because I think when we compare what North Korea, but more importantly China, writes and says about Japan's Indo-Pacific engagement, its new national security strategy, and the changes of its defense posture, I think that what we see is a complete divorce from the reality of what Japan is doing. Lastly, and I think importantly for this discussion about Kishida's overseas visit and what it may mean for Japan and the Indo-Pacific, is again, I think, this broad shared understanding of the security challenges within the region, Japan's priorities, but also that Japan, as it tries to secure its, its backyard, that there's a clear understanding by most stakeholders that Japan, rather than militarizing per se, is taking a primarily security focus that is defensive in nature, and rather than escalatory, it is strengthening its defensive posture to deal with the challenges in Japan's Indo-Pacific backyard. So maybe I'll stop there, and we can open up the floor to a discussion.
Sure, and thank you, Stephen. Yes, I invite everybody who is in the audience, please join us. So let's have a conversation here. And in the meantime, while we're waiting, Stephen, you mentioned that, Prime Minister Kishida, he is actually, let's say, promoting denuclearization of the region. And so I wonder whether you meant that in the sense of denuclearization of weapons, like nuclear weapons, or in general, talking about even, energy sources and resources.
So it's denuclearization in terms of weapons and weapon systems.
Weapons.
Yeah.
Right, because
I think that there's a reality in the Japanese political context that, or in the energy context, that nuclear energy will continue to be a vital part of Japan's energy portfolio, and it's really unrealistic to move away from that platform until they've secured energy resources that can deal with the reality of being the second or third or fourth largest economy within this region. I think that's a really important thing for us to continue to be thinking about.
Yes, indeed. And do you see also any possibilities for Japan to actually promote nuclear energy within the region, even to countries that are not currently having it?
No, I think that Japan is, by and large, promoting its own nuclear energy from the standpoint of thinking about its needs, not thinking about the needs of other states. And I think that we should continue to think about, Japan as not as a country that's thinking about nuclearization for the sense of for defense, but rather for the realities of its limited energy resources.
Right. I also wonder, with this visit to the United States and, of course, the visit to Britain, France, and Italy, so there has been, I think that the trend of actually bipolarization of the world is accelerating. And while we know that, of course, the United States is trying to advance, what's that? Not bipolar world, but its hegemony, let's say, in the world, we are seeing a strong pushback from countries like Russia and China, also some other countries, even in this region. So, do you expect that the world will continue, or that, let's say, the split or the gap between the two poles will continue to enlarge?
Well, I think what you're speaking to is really how authoritarian states like Russia and China, and to a lesser extent Iran, really are unsatisfied with the current international order. And that international order is led by the United States in many ways, but it's broadly agreed upon by many, many countries at the broadest level. There's problems with it, right? I think that the global South would like more representation in that world. But again, countries like Japan, working alongside the United States and Canada and other countries, continue to value and invest in an international system or an international order that we enjoy today because they see it as stable, functional. And I think that countries like Russia and China really see this international order as a U.S.-led order. They see it as something that prejudices their systems, something that threatens their systems. And as a result, they work assiduously to push back against what they see as, an international order that really is in many ways an order that threatens their domestic political systems. So I think that we should be really cautious in terms of how we think about countries resisting this. I think, for example, South Korea, much of Southeast Asia, except for perhaps Myanmar. I think Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, most of the European countries, India, all see the current international order that, of course, has been underwritten by the United States as being broadly something within their interests. But I don't think this is the case for our Russian counterparts and Chinese counterparts.
Yes, but at the same time, I think that a lot of countries in this region, and we have talked about this before, so they don't actually want to choose one side. So they, while they cooperate with the United States in terms of, let's say, defense equipment, they continue to maintain their economic ties with China. So I think that there isn't really a clear cut there. So it's difficult to say, that of course those countries like India and South Korea, they do think that, let's say, that the political system that is supported by the United States is beneficial to their countries. But also, they cannot detach entirely from China. Probably they cannot detach entirely from Russia in terms of economy. So that's so I also wonder what kind of conflicts, or let's say potential conflicts, this might lead to in this region.
Well, I think that we need to be very cautious when we say that Japan and the United States and other like-minded countries can't detach from Russia. I think Russia is a singular, perhaps has two aspects to it. For India, it's energy and weapon systems. The weapon systems themselves can likely be provided by another country, which I think is something that can be replaced quite easily. In terms of energy, this is something more complicated. And for a developing country like India, they look to Russia as really a steady supply of energy and weapon systems to deal with the challenges in their backyard. So I think we need to be careful when we say that they can't separate. I think it's a question of time, and our Indian friends are already diversifying, and it just takes a little bit of time, right? You can't just jump off the boat, or alienate your relationship from Russia overnight. And I think that the Indians themselves as well, they understand the merits of international order that is broadly aligned by aligned with the United States. I do see, though, that Russia and China are trying to promote a different narrative, that the United States and its like-minded countries don't care about the global South, that their interests are being circumvented by the United States and a few like-minded industrial states like Japan or the European countries. And for them, they see the United States and its actions, or how they're trying to interpret it, as one that is manipulative, hegemonic, imperial, rather than having the best interests of Southeast Asian countries and other developing countries in their mind. Is that true? My personal view is no. I think that the United States and the West are imperfect, and generally they have, the interests of the global South also in mind. However, they want to tie aid and support to anti-corruption, to human rights, and better governance. So I think that these are somewhat nuanced arguments, but I think that Mr. Kishida going to all these countries and talking about shared norms and rules-based order really reflect the reality that a country like Japan completely depends on rules to determine how much it can trade and deal with the challenges, and to deal with its economic challenges at home. And in that sense, I think that Prime Minister Kishida's trip overseas this past week really is very much wedded to the free and open Indo-Pacific ideas, the ideas of rules and transparency as being precursors to stability and prosperity in any region.
Right. And then, so let me go through the comments and questions in the room chat. So the first one is from Frank. Well, how about, yesterday, yes, as Frank, as you wrote in the room chat. So yesterday, Timothy Langley mentioned a cooperation agreement on a new military jet with the UK, France, and Italy. So, Stephen, if you can comment on this, if you have any details, I think that it will be appreciated.
So, Frank, thank you for the question. I think that this reflects Japan's long-term efforts over the past 10 or 15 years to really diversify its security partnerships, while at the same time double down on the U.S.-Japan alliance. And working with UK, France, and Italy allows Japan to diversify again its security partnerships, create long-term technological cooperation, trust in terms of intelligence, but also developing a system that will meet the needs of Japan. And I think, again, we need to think about this in terms of the context of what is Japan's objectives, and its objectives continue to be deterring Chinese aggression and North Korean aggression within the region, but also building enough deterrence capabilities that it can continue to work with other like-minded countries to push back against what it perceives as assertive or aggressive behavior. So I think that this Italy, UK, France, Japan deal is important, but it fits within the broader context of Japan continuing to diversify its security partnerships, and that I expect it continue to do that over the coming years to make sure that what happens to Japan matters to not only the United States, but many, many countries that it shares a security partnership with. And I think that's how we should understand this cooperation, as technological cooperation, defense cooperation, but also, again, embedding Japan in numerous multi-layered and multilateral cooperative initiatives to really make what happens to Japan matter to other countries. In short, I think that, again, Japan's cooperation with these countries and producing jet fighters really is about linking Japan's security interests and what happens to Japan to other countries. And I think that's a wise way to pursue foreign policy is to make what happens to you matter to other countries, and that's what Japan has done.
Right. Well, that's a good way to look at it, indeed. And we've got another question in the chats. How do you think the latest BBC documentary about Modi's involvement in the Gujarat riot may affect his relationship with the West?
Well, in the context of Japan and the Indo-Pacific, I think that there is strong support for India's participation within the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, in terms of deepening resilient supply chains, in terms of diversifying the economic footprint that many countries have, because they see India really as having a country that has the potential to balance the size and breadth of China. There doesn't seem to be another country that does have that ability. And again, that makes India really, really important, whether Modi's in power or not. And I want to reemphasize that. I think that regardless of who's in power in India, unless it's somebody that is engaged in a massive human rights abuses or genocide, then I think the West will continue to try and court the Indians, because again, they're such an important counterweight to China's size, and India has huge potential. Whether that potential will be realized will likely depend on how involved countries like Japan and the United States, Australia, and others are in its development and trying to shape its behavior.
Thank you for the response. Yes, India. Well, and there are also other countries that are really important here in the region that are still probably going to decide, or they need to decide, how to define their foreign policies, I believe. But, well, Lynn, no, it's not good morning, it's good evening to you, sorry. How are you today? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi, Lynn. Happy Tet. I hope you're having a nice holiday.
Yes, so I have a questions about Japan's new security strategy, because I read a lot of debate about the announcement of Japan's new security strategy as a departure from its pacifist constitution. I understand that the United States and other G7 countries really welcomes Japan new defense posture. However, from countries like China, Russia, and North Korea, there's a lot of debate about and skepticism about Japan's new security strategy as being departure from its pacifist constitution. So I would like to hear Professor Stephen's views about this.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and again, happy holidays to you and our Vietnamese friends and other friends that celebrate Lunar New Year. So I think that the Japanese new national security law, and I've written quite a bit about it, is important. It's important because it is changing how Japan engages within the region, and it's doing this through several tools. One of the tools that I think is mostly focused on in the debates is this idea of acquiring counter-strike capabilities. I think that these are really important, but we should also think about them in the context of nuclear weapons proliferation in the Korean Peninsula. We should think about it in terms of China's rapid militarization and how does Japan's budget compare to China's budget. And we need to think about it in terms of the alignment of Russia and China on many issues. So in this sense, let's start with North Korea. So North Korea, according to scholars like Iwama Yoko and Masashi Murano, are really trying to develop what we call a saturation capability. And that means basically producing more missiles than the anti-ballistic missile systems within the region can handle, allowing North Korea to really extort or to push Japan and South Korea and other countries into a negotiating position. So here, the national security strategy tries to address this by advocating for counter-strike capabilities to decrease the incentive of North Korea to taking this path. On the China side, I think it's important for us to compare the spending that Japan is proposing in over 5 years to what China is spending today. And we see that China has spent in 2022 about $230 billion on defense spending increases, and that's a 7% increase on the year before, which is a lot, right? And Japan is advocating for a doubling of spending over 5 years. So I think we need to put Japan spending in the context of China's spending and its behavior in many parts of the region. We also have the alignment between Russia and China, which is becoming increasingly challenging as we see this axis of quasi-alliance partners really become more aggressive and provocative in the East China Sea, where Japan has many challenges with not only South Korea, but also China. So I am looking at the new national security strategy through these lenses, and I think that Japan's approach is not revolutionary, but it certainly is an increase in capabilities to deal with the challenges that Japan is facing within the region. But as I mentioned, I think that there is almost, not no, but if you go to Southeast Asia, very, very little criticism of Japan's strategy and its increase in spending, because they see Japan as a member of the international community in good standing that by and large has pretty good track record of human rights, working with other countries to promote international law. So I guess I wouldn't characterize the negative side that you mentioned of Japan's national security strategy and its increased spending. I wouldn't characterize it as so negative, especially thinking about the many countries that have views on this. China's reaction to the national security law is predictable, and South Korea's reaction was nuanced. Progressives looked at it with distrust, where the conservatives looked at it as a matter of fact, considering all the security challenges that Japan is facing within the region. And I think that others really share a similar view. Where it's going to go moving forward will really depend on the behavior of China and Russia, and to a lesser extent, North Korea. But Japan is moving to have a more robust burden sharing approach to how it's thinking about security.
Yes, Professor. So actually, I already read your two articles about Japan new national security strategy. I think one is for the Geopolitics Monitor and one for the Japan Times. And in your article, you pose the question if Japan new security strategy is a practical shift. Right. So my understanding is that you see Japan's increasing defense budgets as a necessary and practical step in response to China's North Korea and Russia assertiveness. But I think that it's also interesting to see that, what we are seeing China, North Korea, and Russia are doing, we also see it as being aggressive. But from their viewpoint, they are seeing themselves as defending themselves. And you also mentioned that the increase of Japan defense budgets over the next 5 years, if compared to China, is quite modest and even inadequate to deal with China's rapid militarization. But you know that if we look back about 10 years ago when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe came back to his office and within 1 year after coming back, he also made a lot of efforts to reinterpret the constitution, amend Article 9, and also seek to increase the country's defense budgets. But now I think that, and at that time, there was also a lot of debate about Japan's departure from its Pacific constitution. But now it seems to be translated into more reality. So do you think that in the long run, I think that this trend will be increased because it could be difficult when you try to seek to increase the defense budget and then reduce or at least maintain it at present. So in the future, if this trend is increasing, is growing, so how good other countries in the region would see Japan, or how much they would welcome Japan's move?
Well, again, I think it'll depend on the behavior of China ultimately and Russia. And if China continues to be assertive and North Korea continues to attempt to extort Japan and the region through its nuclear weapons and missile systems, I think the obvious question is that many countries will welcome a more proactive Japan that's investing the appropriate amount of resources to help with its security. But again, looking at Japan's broader Indo-Pacific engagement, it is multilateral and it's multi-layered, and it continues to take a approach that focuses on the political economy and enhancing its political economic influences within the region through trade agreements, through thinking about supply chains, through big economic partnership agreements like we saw with the Europeans and the Japanese and the EU-Japan economic partnership. And this is really, really interesting because it suggests that Japan wants to embed itself into as many multilateral organizations as possible to support multilateralism, to support international institutions, to achieve its national security interests. And I think this is the correct calculation. The question for Japan moving forward is, can it muster or can it put together the resources to deal with all the challenges that it's facing? And I think the answer is yes. Where the answer becomes more complicated is, do the politics allow Japan to make the appropriate decisions to really step up to the plate and deal with the security challenges within the region? And this, I think, many of us are still, we still don't have an open question, or we still have an open question because, we've seen Japan recognize many issues, but not be able to put the resources in and make the appropriate choice to solve the issues. And that could be trade issues, it could be North Korean issues, it could be gender issues. In each case, we see Japan struggle to make the needed change to deal with the challenges that Japan is going to face at whatever particular time, but in the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. And I think that's the real question that we should pose, or have Japan moved into a position where they take more, where they make more proactive choices to fundamentally change their domestic environment so they can deal effectively with their international environment. And here, I don't know. Their track record is not so good.
Yes, so thank you, Professor. Because I asked that question because from Southeast Asian countries' perspective, I haven't heard so much about their response to Japan's new security strategy. But I know that from the US side and also other G7 countries, they much welcome Japan's stronger defense posture. From the Southeast Asia, I think that I just know Thailand. It also have some comment like ASEAN must now learn how to live with Japan, which is getting stronger. And even though it supported Japan to have the right to defend itself from China, it also want Japan to remain extremely careful. As this trend, the way Japan increasing its budget defense may remind the historical frame of Japan's aggressiveness in the past. So, except from Thailand, I do not hear much from other Southeast Asian countries about this.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, Lynn. At the same time, I think that we should, if you read into that statement by Thailand, it's speaking, out of both ends of its mouth. It's basically saying, we'd have no problem with Japan doing this. It's needed. But at the same time, it's saying, they should at the same time think about its past and how its past may affect how its changes are interpreted. Great point. But again, I think you're right that Southeast Asian countries have been relatively mute. And I think that if you wanted more insight in terms of how Southeast Asian countries are thinking, you need to read the Survey of Southeast Asia or the ASEAN China Survey, because these give you a lot of insight in terms of how other countries see Japan and its reforms. And I think Japan is continually seen as a good faith actor within the region that follows international law. And I think that continues to be the case today.
Yes, thank you, Professor.
You're welcome. Thank you. Great to hear from you.
Thank you, Lynn. Gabor, good evening. How are you today?
Good evening. I just got home and listened to the talk on the subway. I'd like to go back to the counter-strike capabilities or enemy strike capabilities. I was wondering that isn't just North Korea just a useful idiot, a good asset or an excuse to build such capabilities that Japan can develop those level the defense capabilities against the real threat, China, but blaming or using North Korea as an excuse is to do it in a clever way, not to anger China more than they did with the new defense build-up and the new security strategy. Because for me, it's like my impression is North Korea is like a dog that barks, but I can't imagine attacking Japan or the US or other allied countries because that would be a suicide for them. But do you remember the Chinese military drill around Taiwan? And they actually fired a ballistic missile that landed in Japan's EEZ. And so, yeah, what do you think about it? I think they're building against China and secondary Russia to make them more expensive to think about doing something bad in the region.
Gabor, great to hear from you. I hope you're well. I think this is an interesting comment, but I think it's not. I think that North Korea does present a real challenge is when we're thinking about weapons proliferation within the region. And let me just play this out, because I think that the current Yoon administration, although it's backed away from the idea of a nuclear deterrent to deal with North Korea, the discussions are still there. And on my second last trip to South Korea, I was actually given documents by, at that time, conservative party members, the Conservative Party, and it highlighted this idea of a nuclear deterrent. I think the Koreans are serious about this, and if the South Koreans do acquire a nuclear deterrent against the North, the question is where does Japan sit next? Does Taiwan deal with this? Does Taiwan go the way of South Korea? Then where does Japan fit? And I think a nuclear South Korea, despite having many similar values with Japan, would be something that would make Japan's regional backyard much more difficult. I think we should also be aware that the North Korean strategy is really to pressure the Japanese and the Americans and the South Korea to some kind of peace treaty in which they accept the North Korean regime. And as you know, whether it's feasible or not, the North Koreans still consider the Korean Peninsula to be something that they would like to take over in the future. So I think that North Korea presents some real challenges for Japan because Japan is at the front line of security issues for North Korea. Japan is home to many American bases, which would be targeted in some kind of conflict between the United States and North Korea. So I don't see it as a useful idiot. I think it's a problem into itself. Whether acquiring counter-strike capabilities will help deal with this challenge, that is another question. And I don't know what is the best way to deal with North Korea. But I do think that acquisition of these weapon systems are primarily focused on North Korea and Japan and China, and to a much lesser extent Russia, because Russia just doesn't have the capabilities within the region. It has to work with China to deal with the region. So I think it's interesting to think about, but I don't think that North Korea is the useful idiot. I do think it is a very severe problem that could avalanche into weapons proliferation through the whole region.
Oh, thank you. It was an intentionally challenging or provocative question. I agree with you. But remember when, I don't know, a couple of years ago when South Korea was thinking of installing the THAAD system, the biggest backlash was from China, not from North Korea.
Absolutely. And for China, everything is about their relationship with the United States, and I think that is a reality that we need to bear in mind. That no matter what is said, China interprets it through the lens of U.S.-China competition. And while I get this, I think that it's somewhat insincere and doesn't reflect the realities that North Korea presents. There is a lot of talk in the South Korea of, and this is surprisingly interesting, is that the progressives and the conservatives could have an unholy alliance to agree to a nuclear deterrent. And I found this really, really interesting. And you might be going, huh? How could the conservatives and the progressives agree to a nuclear deterrent? Well, from the progressive side, if this is the case, this would mean that it would reduce the argument for a U.S. presence in South Korea. And this has been something that the South Koreans have strived for decades, the progressives, to get the United States out of the peninsula. And having an unholy alliance with the conservatives to get a nuclear deterrent is something that could lead to that. And I think a lot of the discussions that I heard when I was there last is that China would probably accept this because they would understand that the nuclear weapon isn't targeted at them. And if it pushed the United States out of the Korean Peninsula, even better.
Yes. Maybe we'll see an unholy alliance between Japan and South Korea as the threat increases in the region. I'm just joking.
Well, there's the right players are in the Blue House and in the Kante. The problem is whether the Yoon administration can maintain its momentum. What's good is that its President Yoon's popularity has increased to over 40%. Yes, so more than Mr. Kishida. And and this is a positive trajectory, and if it continues in this trajectory, we may see a shift in his ability to take more different choices about Japan that are more positive. Right now, I think he's done a lot of great stuff. He could do more, but he'll have to get the politics behind him.
Yeah, I agree. There's definitely a momentum here for a stronger Japan-South Korea cooperation.
Yeah, and from the Japan side, they just want to see sustainability of that, right? They don't want to see another sudden shift as we saw in the previous Moon administration, because it would create real challenges for how Japan prosecutes its Indo-Pacific strategy. And if you listen to people like Kanehara Nobutsuke, who used to be a national security advisor to Prime Minister Abe, they really see positively South Korea's role in terms of dealing with the challenges that Japan faces and the region faces with authoritarian states. So the potential's there. Whether they can translate that into reality, that's always a different story.
Well, thank you for that, Gabor. Thank you for the provocative question as well. And so it's 5 minutes before 9 o'clock. I believe that we can proceed with wrapping up the room. So to everybody who stayed with us, who joined us here, thank you very much for doing this. We appreciate your being here, also your questions and comments in the room chat, and also joining us here on stage. Stephen, a few words before we close the room.
Well, first, just thanks to everybody that jumped in and shared their advices. I learn a lot from every question and opinion, and helps me shape my thoughts. So thank you. Again, I think that Prime Minister Kishida's visit to overseas this past week was broadly positive for how Japan is creating a critical mass of like-minded countries, demonstrating that Japan is serious about burden sharing with the United States and other countries, and that Japan is part of a broader community of countries pushing back against authoritarian states. And this fits with its free and open Indo-Pacific vision that is really focusing on a rules-based order, not only in the Indo-Pacific, but broadly. And I think that these are good take-homes, and Prime Minister Kishida will probably benefit from this trip. But again, I think that we should always encourage the policymakers in amongst like-minded countries that they can't take each other for granted, and they need to continue to work towards deeper cooperation and commitment in terms of economy, trade, diplomacy, security, and technology, as we really are moving into a period of really high-tech cooperation, competition.
Well, thank you for that. And we'll be here once again at 8 p.m. Japan time on the 6th of February. So join us again at that time. Have a great 2 week. We're looking forward to seeing you here again. Thanks. This was Japan Expert Insights on geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific and Japan's role in the region. Thank you for coming and staying with us today. We will be on air in 2 weeks on Monday at 8:30 p.m. Japan time again, so join us. Until then, you can find us at japanexpertinsights.com and our YouTube channel, where we upload audio episodes on Japanese politics, business insights, and the role of Japan in the Indo-Pacific region. If you want to stay informed about our upcoming events, you can follow us on Clubhouse, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, we are looking forward to your joining us next week. Until then, stay well and make every day count. See you.